Today's episode of the TribCast is sponsored by the Coalition of Education Funding and Raise Your Hand, Texas. Hello and welcome to the Texas Tribune TribCast for February 18th, 2025. I am Matthew Watkins, Editor-in-Chief of the Texas Tribune. And as usual, we are joined by politics reporter James Barragon.
Welcome back, Matthew.
Thank you. I'm glad to be back. And also, you know her as the Stephen A. Smith of the Texas Tribune,
Yes.
Eleanor Klivanoff.
Hello. My sports knowledge is bested only by my politics knowledge.
I go away for 2 weeks, and it's just nothing but hot sports takes the entire time. I can't believe it.
This is as shocking to me as it is to everyone else.
And our special guest this week is our K-12 education reporter, Jaden Edison. Hey, Jaden.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you here. So let's talk about what happened this week. Jaden is here. We're going to talk about the hot ticket item of the legislative session, school choice, school vouchers, whatever you want to call it. But first, let's just look, I think catching up on something we've been looking forward to for a few weeks was the announcement of House committee assignments in the State House. Dustin Burrows doing this for the first time. People watching that to get a little bit of a sense of what kind of leader he would be. James, you covered that story. What did you see?
I did. Well, he followed through on the new rules to not appoint any new Democratic chairs. It's all Republican chairs. And that, of course, was a big topic of conversation in the primaries and in the speaker's race. He also left in place a lot of Phelan's team. A lot of senior lawmakers are either keeping their previous chairmanships, like Greg Bonin on appropriations, Morgan Meyer on ways and means, or they got moved around to other very important committees, like Todd Hunter's back on calendars. Ken King moved up to state affairs. That's a big promotion for him. And also got some good new blood in there. Lacey Hull, I think, is worth noting. She's a third-term lawmaker from Houston. Really went to bat for Burrows and gave a fiery nominating speech for him and stuck with him even when she was being targeted. So she's heading a committee now. Cole Hefner also heading a committee for the first time, like a standing committee for the first time. So, it was interesting to see. I was interested to see how he would manage this. There's always the potential for the speaker to go after people who did not support him and throw sharp elbows. He didn't do that so much. He kind of gave his opponents, subcommittee chairmanships. He gave John Smithy a chairmanship. He was in the running for the gavel as well. So from my read, he's sort of kept everyone happy. I didn't see anybody super upset about the committee appointments. And so he's off to a decent start. He's got everybody calmed down. And now that we've got committee appointments, we can start moving bills through the legislative process on the House side.
It seems like the early reports on Burrows seems to be, and maybe this is because this is possible because, we're not moving legislation yet. We're not having to make the toughest choices. But it seems to be an idea of, people kind of were watching him with knives out, ready to go after him, ready to attack. And he has been trying to sort of mend those fences, whether it's with the governor, the lieutenant governor, or even members of the House, people who voted against him. Would you agree with that? Yeah,
I think also, the reality is that he's a very conservative guy. No matter how his opponents try to paint him during the speaker race, he's a pretty super conservative guy. He's much more conservative than Speaker Phelan. Speaker Phelan has admitted that. He told Evan Smith that at a talk at the LBJ school. So he was going to be a conservative guy, and I think he's going to pass conservative legislation. And he's doing the right things. He's starting right on time at 10 a.m. every day, or whenever they say they're going to gavel in, he gavels in.
He's making you happy for that.
Right.
He's trying to make sure that like things are running on time so that he avoids that criticism. And he's a savvy operator. We wrote a couple stories about him and his relationship with Dan Patrick, his relationship with Governor Abbott. He's a conservative guy. He's a savvy operator. He's trying to keep everybody happy. But, I think you talked about people having their knives out. He's got his own knives. He is he's a tough player in the legislature. So I think he's ready for all this stuff.
We've talked about this before, right? But like in these fights within the Republican Party in Texas, we are again talking about like pretty conservative against conservative. So the gap between, Burroughs and some of his critics on the right is not massive ideologically. So he's got, a chance. But like you said, nothing's moving yet. So right now it's easy to start at 10 a.m. and have everybody be friends.
I
And
think the pressure will start now,
Yeah.
depending on how quickly the vouchers bill moves and then some of the other Senate priorities. Because Lieutenant Governor Patrick's already saying we're not leaving without these bills to change how bail works here in the state. We're going to go to special sessions. So unless those things start moving through the process, I think he's going to start seeing some pressure here, and rightfully so. I mean, they've got to get going, right?
Right. Well, one thing that they could get going on pretty quickly here is a piece of legislation to use state tax dollars to help parents pay for their private school or homeschooling expenses. This has been kind of amazingly the dominant political issue in Texas, particularly around the Capitol, for more than 2 years now. There's the individual kind of fight over this, which Abbott has sort of staked his claim on and has made his, top legislative issue. At least he spends a lot of energy on the border as well, but has been able to kind of take action on that independent of the legislature. And this has been such an issue that it has really, in these past 2 years, not just been a issue of substance in politics in terms of policy, but also really served to reshape the Texas legislature in a lot of different ways that we can really go into. Jaden is here to talk about that with us. And I want to start right by saying where we stand. So the Senate has passed SB 2 already. This is what we are calling the school vouchers bill. It is now time for the House to take it up. Dustin Burroughs, aforementioned Dustin Burroughs, appeared on stage with Greg Abbott over the long weekend, over the holiday weekend, essentially saying, we're going to introduce a measure in the House and we're going to move on that and it will pass as well. So we are looking at a situation we can kind of get into whether we all believe that to be true or not. There are some doubters, at least, still in that realm. But Jaden, I want to just start by having you sort of explain to us what this bill would actually do. Let's start with SB 2. That's the one that has passed the Senate.
Right.
Tell us what this program is, what it would mean for the state.
Right. Well, it only took, I did the math last week. It took the Senate 22 days from the start of the session to pass the bill. So that speaks to somewhat of the urgency that they've tried to move with. But particularly this bill is really interesting, right? I think the premise of it is, allowing the use of up to right now, the base is $10,000 per student per year for a family to be able to, obviously use taxpayer dollars to fund their children's private school tuition through, what we all know as education savings accounts, right? Other, people in the education policy space think of that as it's basically like a voucher plus system, right? Where it, there are particulars about, how, families, receive the money, but for all intents and purposes, they're the same, right? And so that's the base. And then it has additional allocations for students with disabilities. And also sets aside roughly about $2,000 per year per student for homeschooling families, right? And so that's to appease a lot of the homeschooling, groups who in recent years have come out and kind of wanted to be included in these programs. So that's the base of it. Where I found it really interesting, and where kind of a lot of my attention is kind of right now is, there are certain provisions in the bill that anticipates perhaps, a scenario where if demand exceeds funding, then now we have to figure out kind of who to prioritize, right? And the way the bill is currently structured is that it would prioritize the overwhelming majority of those spots for students from two groups, right? Students with disabilities, and then students who come from households, who live at or below 500% of the federal poverty line, right? Where that gets really interesting is that federal poverty, that using that definition, which they define as a low-income household, would mean families up to around roughly $160,000 a year, depending on if you use the 24 guidelines or the 25 guidelines, right? And so that's really interesting, and this created this kind of tension in the, I would say more so obviously from the Democrats. This has been a huge talking point on the floor and in the public hearing at the committee level of if this is a program that's going to prioritize students from low-income families and students with disabilities, and you're creating a prioritization system where students on the wealthier end of a spectrum, are basically treated the same as a family who is on free or reduced lunch, for example, which is significantly, lower. That's about 130 to 185% of federal poverty, right? So significantly lower for a household of four. Then how is it that we're pushing this in the name of kind of low income families and students with disabilities? So that's been the real tension. But I would say that generalizes kind of what the bill is, and then obviously, there's conversations about accountability. It does require, for example, that participating private schools have to take what's known as a nationally normed reference test. So that's basically the SAT or the ACT, right? But no requirement that they take the STAR. And so that's also been kind of a point of contention, as public schools are saying we want an even playing field if you're going to, implement this program. And so those are some of I can pause here, but that's kind of, generally speaking, a lot of the things that folks are talking about right now.
I want to get into some of the details of that, some of the criticisms of this, but let's first just sort of take a step back, James, and make the case for me as it has been made by proponents, Abbott in particular, of why the state needs this.
Well, I think the main argument, and Jaden, you can jump in, but I think they are saying that they are upset with public schools, particularly public schools that are in low-income areas that have not been as successful as they could be for many, many years. And they're saying those kids should be able to have options to go to other schools, including private schools. And that really any parent should be able to take their kid out of their school that they're zoned to or that they go to that's paid by public dollars and take that money that they pay into the state and spend it on the school of their choice. That, I think, is the argument. Of course, private school a lot more expensive than the $10,000 voucher that they are going to get, but that is the proposal.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was watching last night. Governor Abbott was in San Antonio on the stage at a Christian private school out that way. He shared the stage with Dustin Burrows, Speaker Burrows, and also Public Education Chair Brad Buckley. And so it was really, those were also interested to tune in to see, because it was the first time kind of I've been able to see that dynamic on the same. I was wondering if they throw out any nuggets. They're pretty upfront sometimes in those kind of events where they talk about things that are kind of forthcoming. But one of the main takeaways that was really interesting to me is, Governor Abbott talked a little bit about kind of, frustration with, and what a lot of conservatives have deemed kind of quote unquote, left-wing indoctrination, of schools. He cited, recent, news that came out about, a situation in Bel Air High School where in Houston, where basically, there was, teachers who were, basically abiding by a student's request to use different, pronouns, something along those lines and whatnot. And he cited that as an example of kind of the problems that he sees within public schools, that he sees kind of this voucher program as a solution to, right? So I say it to say is, yeah, right. We've heard a lot about kind of academic outcomes, and we know naturally, right? Like public schools, people are struggling to rebound from, the brunt of the COVID-19 pandemic, but there's no secret about it that this also has to do with kind of overall frustration with the direction, this feeling. And I think a lot, after George Floyd's murder, you saw a lot of promises from these public institutions that came out, including public schools. We're going to do better, right? We need to do better in areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And in my view, right, this movement in some ways, right, and I think the governor has framed it this way, is kind of pushback to that's gone too far, right? And so, this is a solution that he sees, to being able to push back and to, offer. And he's at a Christian school, so this is all happening at the same time where we're seeing state officials push for more, religious components, Christianity in particular, in public schools. But also he's making a lot of these kind of talking points, in the background of schools that have a particular Christian focus. So a couple interesting dynamics.
But
there.
that's also, that is a political argument that sort of is, it's a very smart political argument by proponents to make DEI the bad guy, the boogeyman. But the other thing is that some private institutions that would benefit from this also have DEI programs and they have DEI coordinators, right? But this is, I just want to be clear about this. This is like more of a political talking point rather than what the original intent, I guess, quote unquote, was, which was to have like better academic outcomes for kids. There's now a conversation about DEI, the DEI boogeyman, and indoctrinating kids, as opposed to like what the actual academic outcomes are and what would improve academic outcomes for kids. It's a smart political
Yeah.
point.
I mean,
But-
this has been like a long, like
But it's separate.
vouchers and getting public funding into private schools has been like a long-standing conservative issue that has taken different forms throughout,
Right.
like going back to when we started sort of seeing schools get integrated after Brown v. Board of Education. Like this has taken different forms. It has had different political underpinnings. Anti-DEI. Last session, I think a lot of the conversation, and still now, but was around sort of the boogeyman of or the sort of talking point of parents' rights, and parents have the right to sort of direct their children's education, and these other things that we see, political catchphrases, like you said, smart political advertising of an issue that has taken different forms, but it's been a priority nonetheless.
But if a teacher at a public school is a transgender person and they're teaching your kid math and your kid learns math one way or the other, like it really, it doesn't matter, right? If we're just talking about academic outcomes. But what they don't like is the social aspect of this, the DEI part of this.
Yeah, I think the pandemic may have really changed this conversation, right? Because as you point
100%.
out, this has been something people have been advocating for a
Right.
long time. The founding of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, the major kind of think tank in this state, dates back to the 80s. And this was really the main issue of the person who founded it. And, I've been here long enough here covering the Capitol, paying attention to the Capitol, to be able to remember those sort of every 2 years, those rallies on the Capitol steps, people wearing yellow scarves, calling for school choice. And they would pass the Senate and wouldn't really go anywhere. And I think, the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd, which in many ways, the social movement that arose after that, many ways those two things are connected, I think put a lot of fear in a lot of parents' minds, particularly conservative minds, a feeling of sort of lack of control, right? Whether it's I can't send my kid, or I don't like my kid wearing a mask at school, and like all these rules that were put in place. And then yes, all this fear about like is what it being taught at school is sort of getting ahead or going too far from what I'm comfortable with. And I think that message of you can have some more control. Like there was a lot of, even just like with my kids in my public schools, when we all sort of came back to school, there was all this sort of nervousness among parents about like what kind of control they have over their kids' education and what they can do. And whether that's the motivating factor for Abbott and some of these other folks or not, it's the old Rahm Emanuel quote, "Don't let a good crisis go to waste." And this has created an opportunity like never before for this to finally pass.
The money helps too. You talk
Right,
about people
right.
like Jeff Yass, right? I think and correct me if I'm wrong, the biggest single political donation in state history I think when he made the $6 or $7 million donation years ago, right? So, make no mistake. You talk about the kind of national connection. This has been brewing for decades in the making. Where, I read a profile from Jeff Yass in Philadelphia, and it was just really interesting. That he seems to be very private person. So that for him to do kind of a extended interview was really interesting. But he just talked about kind of, this mindset of, if public schools aren't, serving children in the way, that he thinks is, best per se, then they should shut down, right? So, these are people, Governor Abbott has a lot of a reason, from before. I know ProPublica and us, we did some good reporting on this, before this wasn't really an issue that Governor Abbott was top of mind for him, right? But then you start to see more of those dollars pour in, and you make whatever connections you will from that, but it certainly plays a huge factor in kind of this rising to the top of kind of the priority list for a lot of these politicians.
I just want to put a fine point on this, but Governor Abbott has always been an advocate for vouchers. He's been at those school choice rallies since 2015 when he was since he was elected governor. He has not been as vocal, obviously, and we've talked about this in the past.
Priority.
It hasn't been his top priority in 17 or 19 or even 21. It really became an issue in 23, and I think it's to your point, Matthew, which is that the pandemic put a lot of nervousness in a lot of parents. There also was legislation passed in a lot of other states. And so then the school choice advocates are saying, well, how come we can't get it done here in Texas, which is, they like to argue, the most conservative state? So that puts pressure on Abbott. It puts pressure on the state legislature. And now we're seeing pressure from national figures like Elon Musk and Donald Trump to get this done. But that's a little bit of like sort of the context around this.
I always like as you mentioned, ProPublica and the Texas Tribune has done a lot of reporting on the voucher fight, and we had a story I think last year that was like Texas is the largest GOP state to not pass a voucher program, which is also just funny because we're just the largest GOP state. So the minute we do pass it, we become the largest state to have done it.
Yeah.
But yeah, we've been a holdout, and I think that's surprising. You know, we've been
It's
the
the crown
golden
jewel.
goose,
It's
the
the crown
crown
jewel.
jewel. That's the term. Thank you.
I will tell you, it's interesting. I mean, because there are a lot of states that have passed this. I was talking with someone a few
Including
months
Pennsylvania,
ago,
right?
and yeah, Vermont. You know, I was talking to someone in Vermont, the state of Bernie Sanders, right, and talking about how this was the dominant issue in Texas, and they were just kind of like, it is crazy to me
Right.
that Texas has not passed this. Vermont has this measure. So, you know, that's been an interesting thing to watch as well. Jaden, you said the money has affected this. I actually thought you were going to go in a different direction with that, because another way that this has been made possible is because the state has a lot of money to spend, right? And one of the best, strongest political arguments against this is that it's going to take money away from public schools. But what we've had these past 2 legislative sessions is enough money in the surplus to be able to say, we're not going to touch your funding formulas, but we are going to bring in this extra pot of money that will go towards supporting these measures. But there's been a pretty big back and forth in recent days and weeks particularly between Greg Abbott and Democrats, about whether this bill, SB2, does or does not defund public schools. Can you help us sort of navigate this issue and the sides of both sides here?
Yeah, you know, this is one of the the things I find really interesting, right? At a very basic level, I'll start here, right? Public schools in Texas are primarily funded by attendance. So if you're just basically if you look at the simple fact of there are inevitably, probably, if this program passes, there are going to be public school students who leave their public school to attend a private school under this particular program, then by definition, I mean, technically, public schools are going to lose money. And if you look at the kind of analysis by the legislative budget board, I believe, who does the analyses on these, they, you know, in collaboration with the TA, I believe, they make predictions on, kind of generally speaking, how many students, you know, may leave, right? And it's I think it's maybe in the hundreds of thousands, a couple 100,000 or so that they predict in the first year. So I have to fact check myself, but nonetheless, a considerable number of public school students who will leave to go. So by that definition, yes, I think, you know, it's a fact that public schools will lose out on money. Now, there's the second part, which is what Governor Abbott is kind of referencing, is yes, there's a pot of money, the school, that public schools, that funds public schools. And what they're saying is that we're pulling this from a different, pot of money. And so he's basically made the point, he talked about this last night too, is basically you're saying that, we fund infrastructure that's pulling from public schools, right? And that's not the case. But the surplus becomes really interesting. You were just talking to another reporter about this too. It's like, how long is the state going to be operating, where you have all of these additional dollars available to you, right, from a surplus standpoint, right? Like the program, as predicted by the budget board, talks about the cost of this program soaring to, I think, more than $4.5 billion by the year 2030, right? And so are you able to maintain that while also keeping up with the needs of public schools, which are constitutionally obligated to fund? And that also includes, students with disabilities and special education services, all these things that the state historically has already struggled to fund, right? And so I think that's kind of it. And then you get to kind of, the governor more recently. It's been really interesting to see him. He and his social media team have obviously been very aware of some of these talking points, because he's been responding directly to lawmakers and advocates and, about some of the funding talking points. I think a lot of the frustration from a lot of the public school advocates, and the, folks who are, pushing against this program has to do with the fact that there was, I think it was the big omnibus House bill that didn't pass in 2023, had $7 billion in new funds attached to it that didn't pass. And a part of that would have been a raise to the base amount of money that schools receive per student. And since then, in the last couple of years, we've seen, school closures, like budget deficits at high rates, right? We've seen, there's been, cuts to, federal funding as it relates to special education services, right? So there are all these things going on. So hopefully that gets to the specific answer to your question, but I just think there's truth to each thing if you look at it, a little bit more deeply. But go ahead. Sorry. No, I was going to say, but to me, I always go back to the fact that if you just look at the basic fact that, public schools are funded by this metric is going to drastically change if public school students leave to go to private school. And so by definition, you're going to have public schools that lose out on additional funding.
But also the way that they're funding it, the argument is like, okay, just to make it real simple, if the state has $10 to give out, right, and they're giving out $4 to public schools right now, the governor is basically saying we're going to keep giving them $4, but we're also going to give $1 to private school vouchers, right? So that's a total of $5 for education. Mm-hmm. But that's also $1 extra that could have gone to public education. Yeah. So I just want to be like really intellectually honest about what we're discussing here, because you can spin it however way you want it. Like the governor's team is obviously spinning it his way. Democrats and public school advocates are going to spin it that their way. But I want to be honest for the audience about like the funding and like how we're talking about it. And like people can make up their minds about it, but that is essentially what is happening here.
There's a finite amount of dollars.
There's a finite amount of dollars, and there's a decision being made by the legislature and the governor on how that money is going to be spent, and it will affect public schools and private schools one way or the other.
And there's a constitutional obligation to make sure that public schools are adequately funded, right? And so that's part of it. Is like, if you're saying that you're putting, more money into something that's education related, the question becomes, why can't that go into public schools, which we know are struggling in many different ways? But I also think interesting point is that everybody seems to be operating from a different set of facts, right? Like if you talk to the governor's office, they're going to tell you, well, we funded, public schools provided more money than we ever have in history, right? And the Statesman just did, some really good reporting on this, and we've been talking about this as well here is, when you adjust that for inflation, it tells a completely different story. And so even the everybody seems to be operating from a exactly right. Texas, when it comes to per student funding, rates, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but really low. And when it comes to teacher salaries, 30th in the nation, right? So there are real concerns that haven't been addressed. And there is that feeling of, this is the system right here that 5.5 million children attend. This should be the primary focus.
Two things can be true in that they are the highest that they've ever been, and that also Texas falls behind other states in how much we're funding.
Yeah.
All right, let's pause for a second and hear from our sponsors. We have two messages from our sponsors today. First, Coalition for Education Funding. Join thousands on Saturday, February 22nd from 11 to 1 for the Save Texas Schools rally at the Texas Capitol. Fund Texas Schools now. Find information at savetxschools.org. And Raise Your Hand Texas. Public schools are at the center of our democracy. Raise Your Hand Texas believes the future prosperity of our state, our economy, communities, and citizenry hinges on the success of every public school, school leader, educator, and child. Learn more at raiseyourhandtexas.org/get-involved. All right, so we're talking about limited amounts of money here. I mean, another area where there are finite amounts of money is just $1 billion currently being allocated in both proposed budgets from the House and the Senate to support vouchers, $10,000 per student. If you add up the math, if you were to give that to every student currently in private school right now, it would not be nearly enough. $1 billion would not be nearly enough to cover that group. You talked a little bit about how they prioritize here. But ultimately, we're talking about a very strong possibility that quickly supply will outpace demand. What do the supporters...
Demand will outpace supply.
Sorry. Demand will outpace supply.
Demand exceeds the funding available.
Exactly.
About it.
Exactly. Yes. What do the people who are advocating these bills, whether it's Abbott, the authors, or anything like that, how do they address that concern? And what are they talking at all about what the next step will be if it plays out in that way that we just described?
Right. Well, I think Senator Brandon Creighton, who chairs the Senate Education Committee and is carrying the bill on the Senate, really, I mean, it goes back to what we were talking about with the proposed lottery system, right? And to answer your question directly, right? He's gotten questions about, okay, you're saying that this is going to prioritize low-income families and students with disabilities in the event that this scenario plays out where demand exceeds funding. Then, if this is going to do that, then why do we have such generous kind of flexibility within that lottery system itself, right? And he's gone on the record and said publicly, right, like, we don't want to exclude the middle class, right? We want to make sure that families who, whether they, have a child who's, being bullied in a public school or, whether there's any kind of frustration they have flexibility for this. He brings up the scenario of a teacher and a firefighter with 4 kids. He's like, we want to make sure that, they are able to access this program as they kind of, work, essential jobs in the community, right? They should also have, this particular access. But, it goes back to, and one thing I, want to bring up here, which is really, interesting to me, is because we can get caught up in eligibility conversations about who accesses this, so on and so forth, right? There's a difference between eligibility and access. And at the end of the day, let's say you're a family that gets through the prioritization system. You go to a private school, and the private school says you don't meet our standards academically, whatever it may be, so we don't accept you. I have not seen the answers to the questions of what happens after that, right? Because if this is all about helping these students, in other states, for example, you've seen in the past where some, private schools that participate have to have certain enrollment requirements, right? Like you have to, but that doesn't seem to exist in the bills that currently kind of stand. And what we've seen in other programs across the state, overwhelmingly with these universal programs, that the vast majority of users end up being kids who are already in private school, right? Whose families could already afford private school tuition, to some extent. And so, to me, that brings forth the question of, Senator Creighton has talked a lot about, this bill, we're trying to learn from all of the other mistakes that that other states have made, as it relates to this program. But the way the program is structured in the bill right now, as a reporter who's like breaking down this stuff, I'm really struggling to see how, from an access standpoint, Texas is going to be that much different from the way the other programs operate as it relates to who benefits from these programs the most.
Well, and a lot of private schools cost far more than $10,000 a year. So a lot of these, I mean, to your point, like a low-income family that wants to send their child to a private school, if that private school is $25,000 a year, as some of these, schools are, like having $15,000 a year of a bill is not accessible. And so I think, as you said, in other states, we've certainly seen the people who are able to take advantage of this are people who are already accessing those. And, to access, a huge sticking point in Texas on this has been the rural communities where there are no private schools. And so, those areas are
not woke teachers.
Yeah, right. Yeah, like they're not sort of citing the same issues that maybe people in urban areas are with their public schools. But then, they're not gonna send their kids 2 hours to a private school.
Yeah. And what are also too, I would I pose the question too, is like, ultimately, if this passes, what are the characteristics of the private schools that choose to participate, right? Because we've seen in other states is some of the private schools that, you might deem kind of the best, right? Whatever metric you might use to define that, they don't participate because they're probably like, we're already fine. So, and we've seen, some, like, for example, Governor Abbott had a press conference in maybe November. It was after the election, but he had a press conference at a Christian school that was on the verge of closing in recent years, right? So also it becomes a question of like the quality of the actual education that comes into it. And what we've seen, this is one thing that kind of, I guess, frustrates me as somebody who's like trying to like wrap my head around all this stuff, is we hear a lot about academic outcomes. And what we've seen with these universal programs is that, I mean, you look at a state like Louisiana, it's pretty common knowledge from, pro-voucher folks, anti-voucher folks. Academic results were abysmal in that state. At one point, as you looked at kind of public school outcomes, like kids' performance on kind of standardized testing relative to what they did in public school, right? Abysmal, right? And so then the metric of how we define, whether this program is successful or not has started to change. Now it becomes it's not about academic outcomes anymore. It's about parental satisfaction, right? For parents happy about it, right? So I just think there are a lot of these I know that kind of goes a little bit maybe off of kind of what we were talking about, but I just think it's really interesting overall when we talk about ultimately who's going to access these programs and then how do we measure whether the programs actually live up to the promises that officials are making.
Can we all right, I just want to take it a step back and also acknowledge that there are problems with public school, right?
Yeah.
Sure.
There are public schools that have been failing in the state for a long time, and that is a frustration of conservatives, and it is a frustration of parents. It's a frustration of low-income parents because they want the best for their kids. If they could afford private school, maybe they would consider private school. But as a former low-income kid who went to a not good public school, to your point, Jaden, unless it was like a Catholic school that was tied to the churches that like kids in my neighborhood went to, we didn't know any other private schools. And we had no idea how to get an application to one of these schools. And we probably wouldn't have been accepted to these schools because the jump is just so big. So I think I just want to acknowledge the fact that there are problems with the public education system that conservatives are rightly, I think, upset about. But it's the details and like how do we answer these things, and some of these things, I don't think that SB 2 is going to be the definitive thing, right? We're waiting for the House bill. Maybe some of these questions get answered in the House bill, and it looks a little bit different because that was the sticking point, right? The House was a sticking point, and there are new legislators who are more open to voucher system, but everyone keeps saying the devil is in the details, and what are those details? And hopefully we'll find out in the next couple of weeks.
I mean, I do think there's like somewhat long-standing bipartisan agreement, right? That like their public schools need, there's different ways that public schools are not serving communities in the way that we ideally
and
want
advocates
them
would
to.
say funding is the answer.
Exactly, right. It's like we agree on almost everything in Texas, almost everything in politics, we agree on the problem. There's two hugely different approaches to the solution, right? The conservative approach tends to look more like vouchers. The other side would say like, just give that money into the public schools, right? If you let people leave, you were never going to fix the public schools, and you're just going to have the people who don't know how to leave.
We've seen privatization have that impact on other parts of the state.
Right. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it is a conservative belief that the free market leads to improved outcomes for customers, right? And right now, the conservative case for this would be that there are a lot of kids who are stuck in schools that are not performing well, that essentially have a monopoly over the students in that system. You are creating a system where they might now have some money attached to them, which could create new schools to possibly pop up to serve those communities. You're also putting some financial market pressure on the schools that are already in place to improve in ways that may not have existed before.
But I think even Republicans will argue like that, there are charter schools that have been set up to address this kind of thing too. And
right, we've been like trying to fix this for a long time. I think the counter argument, right, is like if you the free market, public school is inherently built to be public. We serve everyone. You potentially hollow out those public schools. You leave only the people that sort of don't get into the private schools or can't access a private school. That's solving the problem for individuals, maybe not for the public. So these are two different approaches to the exact same problem.
Okay, so go ahead, Jaden.
I was going to say, I mean, there's a couple of things. I mean, there's a lot there, but
you don't have to answer for everything we just said.
But it's just, this is stuff. These are the things that keep me up at night, right? And you have to look at, there's a couple of things, right? Because there is a narrative out there, right? And depending on how you judge a public school, right, that public schools are, failing, aren't, we know that, from STAR scores to national tests, right, there have been, struggles for students and schools to rebound, right. The one thing I think about often, right, and I go back to history, right, because if you look, first of all, we're talking about an educational system where largely has struggled to even fully integrate, right, overall resistance to those things, right? And so you're talking about generations of low-income families who are predominantly Black and brown who have struggled to catch up because of those institutional barriers, that are in place, right? And so, that's one thing I think about. But, also, as we talk about kind of, the meaning that the institutions and, how we judge public schools also differs, right? If you ask the Texas Education Agency, you ask Governor Abbott, even, you look at Houston ISD and Superintendent Mike Miles, right? He's a very interesting guy, read about him and talk to him once. Everything that he looks at is all driven by the standardized testing scores, right? And I would venture out to say, right, there are public schools out here that function in so many more ways, particularly in our rural communities, right? But in urban as well, right? That function in so many more ways to try to meet the moment and make ends meet for students, right? I know of a rural school district that literally has implemented washing machines to wash clothes for kids because they're struggling with chronic absenteeism and students not show up to class. And one reason they know is like maybe they don't have clean clothes or adequate resources at home, right? And so I just think we, as a general public, right, have to understand that, standardized testing scores as a result of No Child Left Behind in policy, as we look at nationally, right, all we talk about is a test, but there are so many more factors that go into whether or not a public school is meeting the moment. And I bet you, you go on the ground, you actually talk to kind of lower income families and families that struggle, right? There are things that public schools are doing right now, particularly as it relates to students with disabilities or whatever it may be, that, services and benefits that they can't find elsewhere because of, whether it be private school or whatever it may be. So I just think that's
in
interesting.
some ways, a public school, part of its value is that it is there, right?
Yeah.
It serves everyone. It is, before care, after care. It like allows parents to, go to work. Like there is some inherent underlying value to that private schools also have value, but are not, they're not saying we open our doors to everybody.
Yeah. And it's not even just a Texas, like nationally.
No, that's the promise of public school.
Yeah, and I was going to say too, have we seen a educational system in the country, right, Texas included, where public schools actually have all the resources they need, right? Because to me, it becomes interesting, right?
In some parts of the state.
Yeah, in some parts. I mean,
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
right. But I mean,
some parts of the city.
But even those places, you could argue that the advantage is less what resources the schools have, but more the resources the parents have and the ability to read to their kids and provide proper nutrition and
be
and
part of
many
the
other
booster
factors.
club
Exactly.
for the football
Right.
team.
Yeah, and like it's hard to separate those things when we're so divided by income and other factors. Yeah.
So in the end, the problem is everything.
Exactly. Okay,
Fantastic.
so I want to drill into what's still to be figured out here, because I think the two chambers are in agreement, right, around how much they want to spend, right? It seems like we've sort of zeroed in on this 10,000 base amount, right, that parents would provide. The sticking points, the things that need to be ironed out, it seems like, are what, if any, accountability measures are in place, right? And basically, how do you prioritize when you reach the inevitable point when demand outpaces supply, right? Are there other things that need to be figured out between those two that feel major to you?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I'm looking out for, and we're expecting this week, Speaker Burrows talked about, they're going to file their priority bill this week, right? And so what'll be interesting to me, obviously they'll wrestle a little bit over, it'll be interesting to see kind of, what they allocate per year per student. But to me, it goes back to kind of the prioritization, right? Because the one thing I thought about is like you have some of the kind of more rural lawmakers who maybe the 500% of poverty threshold does not fly with them, right? Like maybe, they have a better understanding of, we have, families in our community who are really struggling. And so that was one thing that I kind of flagged early on, is like, it'll be interesting to see kind of what the competing, like how they kind of, think about that, particularly as it relates to also special education and students with disabilities, right? One thing that I found as a really interesting nugget, I was listening to Speaker Burrows talk to some, civic leaders in Austin a couple weeks ago. And, he kind of revealed how, he has children with learning disabilities, right? And so he talked about getting it right with special education. The House is going to lead the way on this, right? And so, but the one thing to watch out for with that, though, is like Senator Creighton, on the other hand, he's been very reluctant to impose any particular requirements on private schools in these particular programs, right? He wants them to have kind of the flexibility and the freedom to kind of operate, as they feel they need to, right? And so again, I don't know that it'll be in the details, right? You talk about devil in the details of kind of what the things are, but those are things that immediately come to mind as to kind of what are the kind of differing, details that may come up between each chamber that could potentially be kind of points that they need to iron out together. Yeah.
So we are talking about 78, 79, as Abbott calls them, hardcore voucher supporters.
Hardcore.
There's been some folks who would fall under that hardcore camp who have quibbled with different details and things like that. There are people who you talk to in the legislature right now who still believe that there are major roadblocks to this happening, right? You go one way, you lose some votes. You go the other way, you lose some votes. Is that magical thinking, James?
I think they're going to get something done. I think they'll have to sort out some of these issues, particularly like on special education, because you can see it sort of from Senator Creighton's point. You don't want to impose a new requirement on these private schools that don't previously have these requirements, right? But at the same time, if the House is really invested in making sure that kids with special needs also have access to this program, then they're going to have to sort something out. And I think there's going to be more sorting on accountability standards. But I do think that the votes are there. The pressure from the governor is there. The pressure from other places are there. I think they'll figure out something to get done. It's just like, what does that look like in the end? And I don't think that it's going to be everything that's in the Senate bill that passed.
All right, Eleanor, I'm going to direct the last question to you, and it's going to be maybe a hard question. We'll see. But this was the number one issue on Abbott's radar last legislative session. The House succeeded in blocking it due to rural Republicans and Democrats. The impact of that so far has been billions of dollars in funding that would have gone to the schools that didn't. The ousting of many rural Republicans, the election of what I think we could all agree is the most politically conservative Texas House in state history, and the emergence of Greg Abbott as really like Greg Abbott sort of finding his voice isn't the right word, his power, right? In a way that he, I think, wields more influence over the legislature than he has in his entire time. And strikes fear in members of the legislature in a way beyond any other time that he's served in office. How can we not view the decision of particularly opponents, particularly the Democrat side of those opponents, to block it in 2023 as anything beyond just a complete disaster and a thing that has completely backfired on their party and what they want to see the state accomplish as a whole overall?
Yeah, I mean, this is the I think forever balance that we see from the Democrats and people who are interested in blocking sort of the Republican agenda in Texas, that they have to play, which is like, if we stop this thing, is there just a worse thing waiting behind the next corner? And recently it seems like yes, right? I mean, we've seen that with the voting legislation, with abortion legislation, with obviously with school vouchers. It's like the Republican machine on the issues that they choose to prioritize seems to, at this point, to overstate it, I'm sure, like have no limit, right? Like they can just like run like a train right down the track, and if there's something in their way, it might take them longer, but they will get there ultimately. So yeah, it's I think it's very hard to be a minority party for this long and not look back and think like, the things we blocked, did they not just like cause something worse down the road from their perspective?
All right. Well, any like, you want to talk about like the impact on high school sports
I was so
or anything?
scared
Some
you were going to
betting
ask me a
takes?
sports question. I was like, I have reached the end. I will just say, like, Jaden, when did you started on this beat relatively recently? But man, you know a lot.
Oh, I appreciate it.
When did you
yeah.
start?
I started here in June. Yeah, I was covering like criminal justice before, so
Yeah, it's amazing.
some intersection, but not obviously as much. Yeah.
Well, it has been great to have you on. We really appreciate you
Yep, thanks for having
lending your insight. Thank you also to our sponsors, the Coalition of Education Funding and Raise Your Hand Texas. Thank you to our producer, Chris. No thank you to our producer, Rob, who is in Japan. He abandoned Chris all alone.
And abandoned us.
Is that like a business trip, or is that just like
His band.
It is a
Oh,
business
oh,
trip.
okay,
It's
okay.
a-
Oh,
yeah.
fair
Yeah,
enough.
when he
You
comes
know.
back, we'll get him to do a full segment on,
Okay.
on the trip to
Yeah, I want to
Japan.
hear about
Rob
that
is
one,
also the composer of our TribCast theme. Do you think he's performing the theme in Japan?
God,
Do you
I
think
hope
that's what the
so.
fans are
I
asking
hope so.
for?
Yeah. Our Japanese audience.
All right, thanks. We'll talk to y'all next week.